Hey, what's up guys? So as you know, Childe's next banner, his third banner or second rerun, is right around the corner, and so I figured I should talk about him and cover his strengths and weaknesses in this video. I'm going to be explaining why Childe is such an amazing character and whether or not you should pull for him depending on, what type of player you are and the current characters you have, and by focusing on where he shines and where he is a bit weaker. I'm going to try to keep this video structured in a way where I start by covering his strengths and why I believe he's so powerful, and then covering some of his weaknesses, and finally concluding with whether or not you should pull for this character. Overall, I believe this video is one that needs to be made because a lot of people are undervaluing Childe and also just misunderstanding him. And personally, Childe's a character who I've been playing and testing around with since he first came out, someone I've been using non-stop since then, and so I've truly got to experience what this character has to offer. With all that being said, I want to get right into it. So if you don't know, I do stream most nights on Twitch, link in the description, come follow if you're interested. And with that being said, let's go. So first off, we're going to start by talking about what makes Childe such an amazing and honestly S tier character. First of all, as you're probably aware, his elemental skill basically converts his attacks into these melee hydro applying attacks, and my game lagged there, that was kind of weird. But basically you're applying hydro very fast by spamming normal attacks and charge attacks. As you can see, enemies will be constantly affected by that hydro, especially if you're fighting multiple enemies. The reason for that is because there's also this Riptide effect that will also deal hydro damage and deal insane amounts of AoE damage based on how many enemies you're fighting. While I will go more into detail on the exact scalings and the way you should be playing this character in my advanced Childe guide that will come out soon, the main thing you need to take away is that Riptide is this AoE slash that procs when you hit an opponent affected by it, and it's applied by your passive talent on your normal and charge attacks. As you can see by the footage on screen, this Riptide effect just from Childe alone will be constantly exploding when you're fighting multiple enemies, making Childe one of the strongest characters against multiple enemies, amazing in AoE situations. Despite all that though, and despite the fact that his damage is quite high, especially when you look at his elemental burst, which has a ridiculous scaling, especially if you vaporize it, making it great for just burst damage or for speedrunning, his main role and the reason why this character is so good and underrated by people who don't really understand this role is actually as an enabler. What this means is, yes, while his damage is pretty good and especially good against a lot of enemies, he also applies hydro insanely fast. Because of that, you can allow your off-field supports or off-field carries to do their job by constantly proccing reactions. I've noticed a lot of people, even in my Twitch chat like yesterday, saying, oh, if Childe could vaporize every hit, he'd be so good. And while yes, he applies hydro too fast to basically be able to vaporize his own attacks, he enables your other characters like Xiangling to be able to vaporize every single hit of her burst. With a character like Beidou, another meta team for Childe, you can use her burst from off field, use Fischl's Oz as well, and then swap the Childe, start auto attacking, and as you can see, Childe will be dealing, pretty good damage, but it will mainly be the Beidou and the Fischl dealing a massive amount of off field damage as well, through like Beidou's burst, bouncing between enemies, and even Fischl's Oz, and the electro charged reaction that Childe's hydro and their electro allows you to pair together. Childe also does, as I will point out in this video, an insane amount of damage and a similar amount to your off-field supports, which is why his DPS is definitely something worth considering and something worth mentioning, despite the fact that I typically call him an enabler. And we'll cover this a bit later in the video, but while he isn't a traditional DPS of just staying on field the whole time auto-attacking, he will be not only dealing a significant portion of your team's damage, but also enabling reactions and allowing other supports, other burst DPSs like Xiangling to shine exceptionally well. And this specific role that Childe fills is one that's oftentimes misunderstood, which is why I wanted to make it very clear in the start of this video. So that was my sort of overview on Childe. Very fast hydro application, Riptide, amazing burst, and just good damage overall, while enabling your off-field carries. And overall, I have seen him be played in many different roles. In a meta perspective, I do recommend using him as an enabler, but he can be played as a burst support in like quick swap teams, or even as a DPS, although he does have some downtime on his elemental skill. That being said, this downtime on the elemental skill, which is my next point, is actually not as big of a weakness than you might think. While this is the main weakness that people point out, that the cooldown on your Riptide is too long, and in case you don't know, this duration scales off of how long you're in it. As you can see, the max cooldown is 45 seconds if you let it last the whole time, but if you're playing Childe optimally, and again, I will go into more detail on the rotations in a guide, but if you do 10-second rotations, your cooldown will be very short, and you can effectively plan your rotations to where you can use this skill on cooldown with literally no problems and no downtime. The main downside and weakness of Childe is because of this, you need to plan out your rotations, you need to know what you're doing, so he does have a bit of a higher skill cap, which is why in-depth guides of this character are very helpful and why I plan on making one. In a team comp like this one, basically if you use all your other characters' bursts, your Bennett burst, your Fischl's skill, and your Beidou's burst, you use all of their cooldowns together, and then you go on Childe's elemental skill and start auto-attacking, you'll be dealing massive amounts of damage. If you stay inside of Childe's skill for about 9 to 10 seconds, and then swap out and go to your other characters, right? So you're spending that skill cooldown doing your rotation, so getting your Bennett's burst back, going to Beidou, doing a perfect parry, catching those electro particles, spending time on field with Beidou to catch all those electro particles so that she can get her burst back without needing that much energy recharge. You will have an enough time to use your Bennett burst once again, your Beto burst once again, and then when you swap back to Childe, your elemental skill should be off cooldown if you did time it and plan it right. This is the same thing with a Xiangling team. When you're running Childe with Xiangling, you can spend his quote-unquote downtime, the cooldown of his skill, funneling particles into your Xiangling, which is optimal and very, very good because Xiangling is a character who needs a lot of particles. One of the reasons why you run Xiangling with Bennett is because he's a pyro battery for her. Every time he presses his elemental skill, he will generate pyro particles that you can catch on your Xiangling by swapping into her. The main weakness with his skill, and I wanted to talk about this later, but I guess we'll cover it now, is that yes, you know, as I said, you do need to have an understanding on how it works, how to play this character efficiently. If you want to use him as a main DPS, you need something to fill in the gap after, which is why I consider him more of an enabler. He's a character who skyrockets in value when you play him in an efficient team and you play him efficiently, which honestly isn't that hard to do. It's just something that, you know, you have to learn or at least get the feel for. Another big advantage of Childe is that he's extremely free-to-play friendly. First of all, his weapons, while yes, he has some good 5-star ones, he has amazing free-to-play options. The Hamayumi and the Prototype Crescent are both really good, especially with refinement. And another thing is actually concerning his artifacts. While Heart of Depth is generally the best set for him, and I will cover this again in my guide, it isn't as good as people think since his damage is very mixed. Basically, while this set is very good, there are alternatives that can come close, especially if you have good substats, and a lot of sets that you can passively farm for Childe. Since so many characters need the Emblem of Severed Fate, since it's such a very good set, just in general for so many characters like Xiangling, like Beto, like Xingqiu, you can passively get a Reminiscent set by farming for Emblem, and the 2-piece of this can be very nice for someone like Childe as a replacement to another 2-piece you might not have, with the 4-piece also being good in like a Beto team. If you don't care too much about vaporizing your burst, this set can be very good. Also, if you passively have something like a 2-piece Noblesse or a 2-piece Glad or just so many other sets that can be viable on Childe with good substats without losing that much damage, making him very flexible in his builds. On top of that, covering the free-to-play aspect, while his first constellation is enjoyable for quality of life, it's not needed for your optimal rotations at all because your optimal rotations typically stay the same even at C0 when you pair him in teams with like Xiangling or Beto, to where you will get your skill back even without this constellation. And honestly, while a lot of people really like Childe's constellations and they can be fun, their quality of life like his C6, they're really not needed at all and they're pretty bad. They do not actually increase your team's damage by that much, especially compared to other 5-stars, which makes them very accessible to pull for. On top of that, another reason why a character can be considered free-to-play friendly is his team comps. I've mentioned this earlier, but obviously he's an amazing pair with Xiangling. Definitely one of her best, if not her best supports, or hydro pliers, I guess is a better way to say it, because yes, you can use Xingqiu, but Childe is much better against multiple enemies, whereas Xingqiu is more single target. However, and this is the biggest part, Childe can be a second Xingqiu to your account. Xingqiu is an SS tier support for sure, one of the top 3 supports in the game in my opinion, because of how much not only damage he deals, but also hydro he applies and enabling he does to your pyro carries, freeze teams, electrocharge teams, and all that. Xingqiu is needed for so many meta team comps. Think of Ayaka, think of Hu Tao, think of literally any pyro character. Xingqiu is in so many teams that he's oftentimes a contested pick, and part of the reason why new pyro characters aren't necessarily as good as they seem, and part of the reason why people can struggle building like, you know, a Hu Tao team and a Diluc team simultaneously. The thing with Childe is he's another really good hydro applier. So if you're trying to build a Xiangling team and you don't want to use your Xingqiu because maybe you want to put him in your second team with someone like Hu Tao. So Hu Tao, Xingqiu on one team, who are you going to put with your Xiangling? Yes, there's some other teams you can go for, but the best one would undeniably be pairing your Xiangling with Childe. Having a great hydro applier for her while also having Xingqiu on your other team is amazing, especially if either you're free to play or don't have access to that many characters or just want to play meta teams in general. This is why I think Childe is such a vital pull and such a good pull for most players if you do plan on playing the strongest teams in the game. Although, and while I will talk about whether or not you should pull for him a bit later in the video, I do want to specify that if your second team is someone like Ganyu or Shao and you don't need Xingqiu on them, you can very easily run Xingqiu on your first team and not need Childe. I will touch more on whether or not you should pull for him a bit later in the video. Childe's second meta team, as I mentioned, is pairing him with Beto, who was given for free during an event. She's not available for free anymore, but she was for a bit. And so if you do have her, obviously running her with a hydro applier is usually very good, especially with someone like Childe, as he attacks very fast, can enable her, and can apply electrocharged, as I mentioned earlier. While one of Childe's weaknesses, and I guess I'll start talking about this now, is that he does have a select few team comps only where he's absolutely amazing. And that is true, so I want to acknowledge it. The main problem with that argument is that those teams are super meta. Childe Xiangling is one of the top 3 teams in the game undisputably, and Childe Beto is also a really strong S tier team comp. On top of that, Childe can be used in some freeze teams and very good for speedrunning in general. He's also a character who gets much stronger as time passes. passes. The more new characters come, the more characters can be used with him. Since he applies Hydro so fast and is such a good enabler, there are so many future characters that could have potential with him. Fast Electro appliers, fast Pyro appliers, or any character who can apply that reaction or that element from off field might be very, very good with someone like Childe. He's therefore a character that I believe has a lot of potential, probably won't get power creep, and will only get better as time passes. For his pretty objective weaknesses though, other than his team comps being a select few, is, as I mentioned, that you do need some rotation knowledge to play him efficiently. If you're just pressing his skill and auto-attacking the whole time, not only will you be dealing less damage than a hyper carry if you're not using your supports or your off-field carries like Xiangling to back him up, but you'll also have an insane elemental skill cooldown, making him feel just clunky and weird, which is why knowing how to play him efficiently is so important. Another weakness I want to point out is basically his role as a character. As I mentioned, while he does deal a lot of damage, he is mainly an enabler, and he isn't a hyper carry. That means that if you're looking for someone who you can only just build them and then not have to think about anything else, obviously someone like Ganyu or Hu Tao will fill that role a bit better. However, I do want to point out that Childe is someone who's still pretty good at low investment. While yes, he scales well with investment because his damage gets a lot higher and his burst gets a lot better, you can focus on investing in someone like Xiangling who can actually like hyper carry you even if your Childe's on low investment by just enabling her Vaporize. Basically, to show you guys what I mean, while Childe is a character who, wants investment, he doesn't need it to just at least be useful. I put my Childe on a level 1 weapon to show this off, and basically no artifacts. I just kept the flower so I wouldn't die, but no real artifact bonuses and a level 1 weapon, just to show you guys that, obviously my Xiangling has good investment here, but that's enough to at least allow her to be a hyper carry, and so Childe will at least be useful here. As you can see, if all I do is use Bennett's ult, and then a Kazuha E to buff my Pyro, Xiangling's burst, and then I auto attack on Childe, my damage goes from 26k to 47. As you saw, my non-vape did 26, you guys saw that at the start, and now I'm doing 47ks every time I vaporize because of Childe auto attacking very fast. Yes, this was a Xiangling Bennett showcase, I know, but the point is, Childe basically doubled my damage just by applying that Hydro, and then on top of that, if you do invest into him, he'll do more than just, double your Xiangling's damage by also dealing damage himself with your burst, your elemental skill, normal attacks, charge attacks, and all that. Also, I did say double damage, but to be more precise, reverse vaporizing from Pyro onto Hydro is 1.5 times, but then there's also elemental mastery and all that stuff that get factored in. So I don't want to get into all that right now, but basically he's just amazing. And so a weakness that I want to make very clear that I already touched on, but that I want to re-emphasize to not only hype up this character is once again his team comps. While I did mention that he has some very meta teams, if you don't need a second Xingqiu, if you don't need a second Hydro Applier, right, which is very good in many teams, but if your second team runs someone like Eula or someone like Xiao who doesn't need Xingqiu, getting a Childe will only be a slight upgrade or, a pretty decent upgrade to your Xingqiu, but not enough to where you should feel forced to spend your Primo Gems. This brings me into the should you pull for Childe section. In general, we saw his strengths throughout this video: amazing AoE damage, great Hydro Applier, and especially allowing you to run Xingqiu in your other team, having 2 great S-tier Hydro Appliers, will be not only an enabler but also deal a massive amount of damage, and is very free-to-play friendly. And I also think he'll be better the longer Genshin is out, the more characters are released. However, on the flip side, he's not a character that absolutely everyone needs. If only one of your team needs a Hydro Applier like Xingqiu, while Childe will give you a DPS increase to Xingqiu in something like a Xiangling team and can be better, he probably isn't worth pulling just for that slight upgrade if you don't plan on using Xingqiu in another team. Lastly, as I always say, it is worth pulling for characters you like, but since this is more of a meta video than anything, I kind of have to balance between recommending who I think is strong and also telling you that you should pull for the characters you like. Childe is definitely strong enough to be worth pulling for though if you do have a team that can use him, and again, I want to reiterate that most of his teams, although they aren't as flexible as some other characters, are very, very powerful. And yeah, I'm being pretty honest, Childe's a character that I enjoy. I got him Friendship 10 within a week he came out or something, and I've been playing him ever since. He's a character that I believe is underrated overall, despite being rated pretty highly, if that makes sense. I just think he's really good and oftentimes misunderstood. But he also does have weaknesses that I tried to point out in this video, making him not necessarily for everyone, so don't feel forced to pull for him. I wanted to kind of clear that up and explain the nuances on this character and when he's powerful and when he's weaker. With that being said, I hope this video was helpful. There will be a complete Childe guide coming out soon, an updated one covering weapons, weapon rankings, artifacts, team comps, rotations in more detail, and a showcase and all that. So that's about it for me. I hope I did a decent job at keeping this video not too long, but also covering everything about this character so that you can decide whether or not you want to pull for him, and so that I can cover his strength as a character. So that's about it for me. Be sure to subscribe if you're new and if this helped you out. And with that being said, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.